Hi, I'm Jim Grossman. I'm the executive director of the American Historical Association. And what we've been trying to do over the last 5 or 6 years is to help Americans broaden their notion of what history is. Too many people think that it's a bunch of names and dates and facts that they once tried to learn and were bored to tears. And our emphasis is that everything has a history, no matter what you're interested in sports, gardening, whatever it has a history. And today I'm in conversation with Lonnie Bunch, who is the director of the National Museum of African American History, to talk about how that translates into one's vision of a museum. So, Lonnie, I'm interested in how collecting and how the notion of what a museum is has changed as we've realized over the past, say, 30 or 40 years that history is not what people used to think it was, that everything has a history.
Well, the challenge for this museum was to realize that in 2005, when I started, what is a 21st century museum? How does a 21st century museum go from a museum that traditionally would be viewed as a story by African Americans for African Americans? How do you make that a more central story? So our notion was that what we were doing is we were telling a people's journey, but we were also telling a nation's story. And so the notion of being able to say that these questions that you're going to grapple with, questions of slavery and freedom, are really key to understanding American notions of liberty.
So 70 years ago, the what in a sense became the classic work of African American history was called From Slavery to Freedom. So our understanding of African American history, at least those few Americans who cared,
Right.
Those few white Americans who cared, African Americans cared, white Americans' ignorance was matched only by the extent to which they didn't care, was that this was a march from slavery to freedom. How has that changed over time?
Well, first of all, it was a march to slavery to freedom that was a black march from slavery to freedom. I think part of what's changed is that we recognize that it's not simply a black march.
When John Hope Franklin published that classic work, From Slavery to Freedom, if there had been a National Museum of African American history and culture at that time, how would it have collected?
Well, I think first of all, it would have believed that it couldn't have collected, that most of the history of Black America was gone. And that if it did collect, it would really look at what it could find about slavery, what it could find about the sort of emancipation, but more importantly, what it could find about the movements to find equality in America. I think now what you do is, first of all, recognize that so much is in the basement, trunks, and attics of people's homes. And that, in fact, of the 40,000 artifacts we collected, 70 to 80% were in basements, trunks, and attics. So it made us realize that, first of all, this history was important to people and preserve this history. But also, it meant that we had to tell a fuller story. We had to tell stories about culture. We had to tell stories about diaspora. We had to tell stories about violence in a way that we wouldn't have done 70 years ago. So in some ways, what Slavery to Freedom taught us is that the story is broader than slavery and freedom. But if you illuminate that story, it means that you've got to illuminate all the dark corners that will sometimes make Americans uncomfortable.
How do you convince or how do you bring people to understand that the stuff that they have in their attic and their basement is important? So many people will say, well, I'm not very important. I'm not historic. I didn't participate in history. And yet, if everything has a history, then everything in a sense that people own is part of that history. So how do you, as the director of a museum that's trying to collect this, how do you convince people of that?
Well, what you do is you steal from everybody, right? So we take the idea of Antique Roadshow. Everybody watches Antique Roadshow. So we said, basically, we want to come to your town and we want you to bring out the stuff. We're not going to tell you the value of it, but we're going to help you preserve grandma's old shawl or that 19th century photograph. And when people bring out the stuff, we talk to them. We take their oral histories. We talk about why that pocket watch from your grandfather who was a Pullman porter, why that was important. And we begin to tease out then stories they tell us about the Pullman porter and what he did when he went from Chicago to Alabama to Los Angeles. So for us, it was really not so difficult to convince people that their stories were important once we said, the Smithsonian's coming because you can help us tell the story of America through an African American lens. And people, it was almost as if people were waiting, that they knew these things were important and they were waiting to share them. And I think the greatest contribution has been that people trusted the Smithsonian and gave us not their stuff, but their stories, their histories.
So how do you think that affects people in other ways? I'm curious. If people have this broader notion, if we can convince people of this broader notion of what history is, let's take as an example, your daughter is a physician, and the first thing a physician does when a new patient walks in is takes a history. How does that history that a physician takes, do you think, change as a physician learns, as a physician walks through this museum or takes a history course and learns that history is not a bunch of names and dates and facts?
Well, don't they learn to sharpen their questions, right? Don't they learn to understand what this means, not just yesterday, but today? And that what I hope this museum will do, candidly, is if you look at all these artifacts, if you look at these stories, some are very difficult, some are ripe with resiliency. What you want is you want people to be changed. You want people who think this isn't their story to suddenly realize, boy, it sure is. That if I'm really trying to figure out how America has changed in terms of sort of equality for women, or LGBT issues, suddenly to realize that the roots of these are often in an African American experience suddenly gives people this sense of ownership. Or if I am really trying to understand that, what do I make of the fact that I first met African Americans in the military in 1952? Suddenly I realize that even though I'm not African American, that story of the integration is my story as well. So the goal, what you hope, is that people will be changed, they will see themselves, and if they think this is their story, then they suddenly realize that it's much more complicated, much more nuanced, and that it's not a linear march to progress. But what you want more than anything else is you want people to come through a museum like this and realize that change can happen and that individual actors as well as collective groups play a fundamental role in changing America. And what you want is you want everybody to come through to realize they've got an obligation to help America live up to its stated ideals.
That's interesting because when people think about what history is, what they often don't realize is that studying history is studying change.
Yes.
And you hear all these people saying, why should my son, why should my daughter be a history major? You can't translate that into a career. And what good leaders know, such as yourself, is that good leadership is stewardship of change. It's making change, it's shaping change, and we as historians are the ones who understand change.
Because isn't that the key? Understanding change, understanding the limits of change, understanding that change is an ongoing struggle. It just doesn't happen, you know. And so I think that in a way, part of what you're trying to do is to get people to understand that the past has meaning. Right?
But that's interesting in a museum context because people actually, I think, often use the word museum as a metaphor for not change.
Right.
Their house is a museum.
Right.
Well, this is the way it's always been. It ought to go into a museum. So how does a museum communicate this notion that history is about change, that history is relevant to everyday life because, as you were saying earlier, it helps people to shape change themselves?
In some ways, it really is the issue of how you show people a sweep of history. See, what happens with museums is when they get real narrow, when they say, we're going to tell a story about X that fits in this box, but doesn't help people understand how that's part of a broader look. And so this museum was crucially designed to say, here's a narrative of history. Here's where you see change. Here's where you see victories. Here's where you see defeats, so that you begin to realize that by the time you walk through even the history galleries, that what you're really imbued with is change, activism, struggle. And I think as those active things then begin to shape the visitor as he or she begins to think about not just the rest of their visit, but what they've taken away from the museum. I think it's really important that museums have to explicitly think about, through their programs, through their exhibitions, through their collections, how is a museum as much about today and tomorrow as it is about yesterday? And just asking that question as you craft exhibitions, as you think about collections, gives you different answers that I might have given myself 20 years ago.
How do you balance that, though, with sensitivity to people who think that we must be cautious about change? To the many people in our country and others who feel that sometimes change happens too fast, mm-hmm. that sometimes people who seek change aren't thinking clearly, mm-hmm. Who want to move a little more slowly. So how do you balance that impulse towards thinking about change with a wider range of political perspectives?
Well, I think, first of all, what one does is recognize, by crafting a narrative, that this is not just change happening. It's about strategy. It's about education. It's about planning, so that you begin to say that there are moments that change occurs very quickly. But if you look at, let's say, the civil rights movement, you've got 60 years of people developing strategies and innovative ways to use the media to affect change. So part of what you want people to realize is that change just doesn't happen, and that there's loss and sacrifice, but that there's also planning. And that, in essence, what you really want people to realize is the most important thing is to have a vision of what America could be, and define what are the ways that begin to move you there. And in this museum, you will see many different paths to that, whether it's a path of the Black Panthers and militancy, or whether it's a path of Frederick Douglass sort of clearly delineating what he expected America to be, whether it's the role that Black women took as teachers in Southern schools in the 30s and 40s, so that in essence, what you want people to see is that there's not a single path to change, but that change has really been the one constant in this community's history.
And is there a place in a museum like this for people who are even more cautious? Say Reverend Jackson in Chicago, mm-hmm. Who was not happy about King coming
right.
to Chicago.
Right.
Is there a place in this or other museums for people in the South who opposed the civil rights
right.
movement, for African Americans in the North who weren't sure about that as a strategy? How do you tell that story respectfully as well?
Well, I think what you do is you tell it as an equal story. Right? That when you look at some of the media that's in the museum, you suddenly see the debates over civil rights, the debates over strategy, the debates over whether or not when King comes to Chicago, that's a bad thing in terms of what happens when King is there. And so I think it's important to give people nuance and complexity. And in a way, you can criticize this museum, for example, because we do a deep dive into this history, that we really do give you this more complexity than you might normally get, because I think the story deserves it. And to understand how America has changed and where it hasn't changed, you've got to understand what people were able to accomplish and what people were able to believe in.
So in a way, what you've done is communicated, I think, a sense of humility. And in a way, that's at the center. I would argue that's at the center of historical thinking, yes. Is that kind of humility and recognizing that people in the past have some of the same limitations that we do.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And the notion that 19th century folks are not the same as 20th century folks or 21st century folks, but they grapple with some of the similar ideas, which is, how is it that you struggle for change, but don't let struggle define who you are? And so we really try to look at all these different strains, to help people understand, in essence, the complexity of a community, the complexity of a country, the complexity of a history.